Hi, welcome to the Narrative-Based Medicine Lab. I'm Karen Gold, curriculum lead.
I'm Damian Tonopolsky, the creative lead.
And I'm really delighted to welcome Leanne Toshiko Simpson to talk with us today. And I'm just going to read a short bio on Leanne. Leanne is a mixed-race Yonsei writer, educator, and psychiatric survivor from Toronto. She loves writing joyful, messy, laugh-out-loud stories about living with mental illness and the moments of hope that help us get out of bed day by day. Leanne is a graduate of University of Toronto Scarborough Creative Writing and the University of Guelph's MFA program, and is currently completing a doctorate in social justice education at the University of Toronto. She teaches seminars in disability arts and BIPOC literature at Trinity College and is a co-founder of Mata Ashta, a national writing circle for Nikkei communities. She was named Scarborough's Emerging Writer in 2016 and nominated for the Journey Prize in 2019. Leanne also launched a reflective writing program at Canada's largest mental health centre after being hospitalized for bipolar disorder. Her debut novel, Never Been Better, is inspired by the community she has found through her mental health advocacy work post-institutionalization. Welcome, Leanne. We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wonder if we could start out with you talking to us a little bit about your new book. That might be a really nice way into learning more about you and your work and how you're using your writing.
Yeah, I think that there are certain topics, and mental health is one of them, that people have a little bit of fear around. I think it brings up a lot of feelings for them. I think that sometimes people don't want to feel uncomfortable or be reminded of something that is very real and very prevalent. And so I struggled for a long time to write about mental health in a way that felt safe and accessible to me because I had a lot of trauma from being in a psychiatric ward myself. I had a lot of really hard years. And sometimes when I would say, oh, well, I'm writing about bipolar disorder, people would get this look like, oh, I hope you don't ask me to read that. And I thought that was really interesting because I think that a lot of people have experience with mental illness, but maybe they don't seek books about it unless they're trying to educate themselves about a specific aspect of that. And so I decided to write a rom-com partially because I thought it would be a good vehicle for people to learn about mental health in a way that felt safe and accessible and made the writing safe and accessible for me at the same time. Because in rom-coms, there's a happy ending. And so you're writing towards that while getting to delve into the layers of psychiatric institutionalization and recovery and medication and all the stuff that can feel a little bit sticky as you're moving through it. So it's an unusual mental health book, I have to say, but I hope that it reaches people who might not be in its usual readership, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like an interesting and kind of unexpected genre in which to explore that kind of story, which maybe makes it quite powerful and quite accessible to people.
Yeah, I think when it comes to rom-coms, people talk about tropes. People know the rules of the game in a rom-com. Like there's a meet cute, there's some conflict and obstacles, and you eventually get towards this happy ending. But I think that linearity is disrupted a lot by mental health, where you're maybe sometimes not always in love with yourself in the way that you're trying to love someone else and care for them while you're maybe not caring for yourself in the ways that you need to. And so I thought it was an important complication to address, and I think that shifts the trajectory of the entire narrative. But by working with an established form, I'm able to kind of play with the rules and ask, like, who deserves to be loved? What kind of love is valued? What does community care look like? And I think it asks a lot of bigger questions than sometimes people are used to. I think it's a bit of a trap, the book, and I think that's good. I think it's good for people to bend genre a little bit.
It also makes me think that, this whole relationship between trauma and writing and, as a writer, how you experience that in terms of being able to revisit your own experiences and, of course, like create fiction from that and fictionalize experiences, but also what did you need? What kind of either distance or not distance or community so you could revisit some of those experiences and be able to explore and write about them? Because I know that can be difficult too.
Yeah, I think that I thought when you lived with mental illness, you had to write a memoir. A lot of books, if you Google like books on bipolar, books on depression, there's a lot of like help guides and there's a lot of memoirs for people to learn from what other people have been through. And I do think that that's really helpful. I know that Kay Redfield Jameson, Margaret Trudeau, Ellen Forney, like those books were really formative to me when I was first diagnosed. But at the same time, when I went to just kind of put what happened to me on the page, there was this huge mental block, and I never could finish what I was trying to start. And I was in an MFA, so I really needed to finish so I could graduate. And so I think that the container of a rom com helped me put a layer of creative distance so that I could finish and I could access a lot of memory, but also fictionalize in a way that gave me more freedom and support than I would have had doing memoir. And I talk about containers for stories a lot when I teach mad writing workshops because sometimes I think we are just asked to put our story down and educate people in a way that like can be helpful if that's accessible to you, but sometimes we're not there yet. And so I think that having a shape to work with can help us not just rely on how we remember, but also have a little bit of editorial and mental space to be able to reshape and analyze a little bit more and get that extra layer of perspective in between.
Could you go into that a little bit more for us, actually? Because I know that you've studied narrative-based medicine, and academically you've explored health humanities, and you also lead the workshops that you've just described. So how has that been an influence, both a help to your writing, but also more generally as a field that you're exploring?
Yeah, you know what? I think the whole shape thing, and I'm writing about this for Mad Methods anthology, an academic collection right now. I think hermit crab essays offer a lot of potential for taking illness narratives, which are not always recognizable for folks who don't have that experience. And by working with a recognizable shape like a recipe or a playlist or an obituary, whatever it is, whatever form you choose to explore, I think that it gives something else to the story and helps us question why illness is invisibilized or is asked to take certain shapes when we're working with another established shape. So I like the kind of intertextuality of that. And so I'm writing about that in terms of memoir. I ask my students to write hermit crab essays in my BIPOC literature class because I think it's some of the most creative and innovative work that I see from them every single year. And I think part of the reason why I started doing that was when I went to teach mental health writing workshops actually in the psychiatric ward because I taught them first in a mental health community center, which is mostly outpatients, like folks who are kind of trying to get back into the regular routine of their life or build a new routine. But when I was in the hospital, I think there was a lot more fear about triggering people who were still in like kind of like the very, very early stages of recovery. And so I think that a lot of my writing prompts tended to take on different shapes in order to add a protective layer. And I think that's something that ended up seeping into my own writing and my own teaching. And I find that most of the time, people, when they're asked what happened to you, they can kind of freeze and then maybe they don't want to write about that. But when we are thinking about a certain emotion, maybe it's fear, and we think about a song related to that fear, and then we write a memory associated with that song. We are still writing about maybe something that we'd experienced, but it's through a channel that doesn't feel so head on. And I think sometimes it just gives people the flexibility to go as deep as they want or stay a little bit more on the surface. And it's that optionality that I think is very helpful. And the workshop I just ran at Fountain House in New York, we built a collaborative class playlist. We were thinking about bravery because a lot of the readers, the writers there were reading at my launch at Fountain House Gallery on Thursday. And so we all picked songs that made us feel brave and wrote down some of the memories that were associated with that. And a lot of people did choose to talk about how hard it is to disclose at work or in social circles or in relationships. And so we got to a lot of the stuff that maybe we could have written about more directly, but it was a bit more of a roundabout path. And I like the idea of making a whole class playlist because then you have kind of like an audible memory of what kind of was shared in that space.
It sounds like intriguingly paradoxical, right? That you're encouraged to engage with a form that has, it's alien, or it has some constraints, or it has its own expectations. You think that's going to be limiting, but it ends up being freeing, because you're kind of freed from that kind of blank page or that expectation of meeting the certain kind of story you're expected to tell.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to that idea of playing tennis without a net. Like sometimes form, I think, can release things in us. And I am not a poet by trade. I trained with Daniel Tisdale, and I went in. I was like, Daniel, I'm not a poet, but I'm really having a hard time in school, so I'm going to take all of your classes. And that poor man taught me poetry. At first, he was like, Leanne, I see you're just writing stories and breaking the sentences up. And I was like, that's exactly what I'm doing. I need to pass.
And is there something wrong with that?
Yeah, well, I learned about the importance of line breaks and enjambment later on, and but I think that I really gravitated even then towards form-based poems because it gave me a set of rules that I could choose to break or engage with or challenge. And I think, like, even though I don't write, I write like one poem a year, basically. I think that lesson has really come through in the way that I approach writing, and that sometimes, like, starting with some sort of outline or shape allows us to reveal its deficiencies or maybe find soft spots for ourselves as writers. So, yeah, I think that people do really interesting work when they are given a little bit of rule breaking in the process.
I mean, I really am intrigued also by this idea of the use of structure and container. Also, sometimes as a way to give us a little bit of creative distance from experiences that might be actually, as people say, hard to tell and hard to hear. And I'm also really intrigued by this idea of approaching things from the side, indirectly, whether it's a theme like bravery. And there's this idea I've heard, too, that if you give somebody a very open-ended prompt, write about a lunch or write about a picnic, people will go where they need to go. People will write about what they need to write about. You don't need to be directive around that. And I just wondered about your thoughts around that in terms of your experience working with the communities that you do.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's why, like, when I explain hermit crab essays, like when you think about a hermit crab, it's a little squishy guy, and like that story is very squishy, and then the hard shell kind of protects it and gives it a bit of space. And I think people appreciate that because we're acknowledging, number one, that writing is hard. Writing when you're in a psych ward is hard. You don't have a lot of freedom, so this kind of writing freedom is maybe what you get that day, and so it's very valuable and precious. And I think that acknowledging the vulnerability of what we're doing to start really sets the tone. And another thing that we do before our writing workshop is we go over a comfort agreement and we work through we set the ground rules together as a group so that everyone's on the same page, because not everyone has writing expertise. Sometimes people want to give feedback when we don't really need feedback. People just want to be heard. And so we work through a lot of that together at the beginning. So it is like a collaborative space. And I feel like one of the most important things in my teaching is that when I come in, I let people know that I have been in a psych ward and I'm not coming here to tell you how to overcome it, because that's not really, I've not overcome it. It's just kind of become part of my life. And we are peers first, no matter if I'm teaching at the university on my off days, but we're peers first. And I think that makes a really big difference in the reception of the workshop as well. And I think it's nice for people to see like how the skills that you're working on while you're in a space where you don't have a lot of freedom can carry you through afterwards. Because one of the hardest things of getting out of a psych ward is like your life has been scheduled very intensely the whole time you're in there, and you get out and you have this weird expanse of time. Like you can be in the shower as long as you want. You can eat whatever you want. You might have real cutlery for the first time in a couple weeks, and it's a little bit overwhelming. And so then again, I think that idea of having some structure, even if writing becomes part of the routine that you can maintain outside of the ward, even if other parts have disappeared, I think that that's something that is really helpful to folks too. If you have a practice that you don't need anyone else for, but you can engage with on your own. And that's what it was for me as well.
It sounds like this work has deep personal meanings as well as creative and aesthetic aims, communication aims. More broadly, as advocacy, are there institutional changes or social changes or broader changes that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I think that more places are doing arts-based engagement. I think it's really helpful. When I was in the ward, we didn't get a lot of great recreational therapy, I have to say.
Mm.
And not that I think writing has to be therapy at all. Like, in fact, I actually go in and I'm like, well, we're not doing therapy, we're doing art. And
Mm.
that is enough on its own. We don't have to have our art fix us for it to be valuable. That's I think the difference
Mm.
between art therapy and the kind of workshops that I run, it is very different. But I'd love to see more arts-based engagement. KMH has a wonderful therapeutic, like a recovery college program, and they do have writing workshops there. I haven't taught there since COVID because it was very hard to do over uh, online.
Mm.
It was really, really challenging because they were already so understaffed, and then to set up like
Yeah.
8 iPads, and have them all function, and it not being in the space with the
Yeah.
folks too, it felt very different.
Mhm.
So I think that things are shifting and they're putting more arts-based engagement. There's photography
Mm.
classes, there's drawing, there's painting, there's a lot of really great stuff. And what I love about the Workman Arts program is it's all people with lived experience going back and facilitating these workshops as peers and as community leaders. And I think it's really impactful for people to see like what is possible after this time in your life. And it doesn't mean that you never go back and that's like a bookend or anything, because a lot of people I know have been in and out, and
Yeah.
there's always that kind of chance that things will get hard again, but at least you know what is possible after that, no matter what stage of your journey that happens in. So I really love what they're doing there, and they
Mm.
also have done some really wonderful writer in residence or like artist in residence programs, so that people have mentorship after they leave the hospital, and I think that's really nice too.
I mean, I'm sort of struck by what you're saying about writing as therapy, writing as art, writing as creative expression. And I'm thinking that we sort of try to navigate a little bit of that in the
Mhm.
narrative based medicine circles, where we're often, as you know, working with healthcare providers, healthcare learners, trying to sensitize them to also patient and survivor
Mhm.
stories. That's one element of narrative based medicine, as well as healthcare providers being able to express their own stories and being sensitive, more sensitive to narrative.
Yeah.
And, often we talk about how, this is not therapy.
Mhm.
It may, in fact, be therapeutic in the broadest sense of the word.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, yeah, if you can just talk a little bit more about how you see that, the relationship to healing, what some people might call healing or recovery.
Yeah.
Just that's an interesting tension.
It is. Actually, when I pitched my first in-hospital program, they really wanted there to be like a point almost. So I actually had to frame it as like it was called Resilience Writers.
Hmm.
And it was interesting because like, oh, so we're writing for resilience. And we were, but I don't think it was in the same way that the hospital necessarily understood it, because I think sometimes the resilience is actually getting through the day to day of the hospital and maintaining a sense of agency. I do think that when you're in a mental health space, like your story is narrated by a lot of other people, like
Yes.
doctors and nurses and therapists and your family who's very worried about you or your friends. And there's something really special about being able to like take control of that authorship again, and write about yourself in a way that feels unique and special to you. And so um, we were writing for resilience, but I think
Mm.
we were writing for resilience within the system, which was kind of an interesting place to be. I thought about
Yeah.
the title of those. Those were some of the original workshops I taught there, and I don't think I would title it
Mm.
the same now, but I think in order to get it off the ground, it was very necessary at the time, because you're working with an institution that understands wellness in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I would say that I actually understand unwellness a little
Mm.
bit more than I do the
Mm.
idea of wellness. Mimi Cook is a really wonderful Asian American scholar who
Mm.
talks about teaching from a pedagogy of unwellness. And it's
Mm.
the idea that we are all differentially unwell
Mm.
based on a lot of the social historical structures that surround us. And so it's really hard to understand um, unwellness as like, oh, well, I have this diagnosis and it exists in the space. I'm going to work through it and then it'll be gone. Whereas I feel like I carry my unwellness around with me, being a descendant of Japanese Canadian internees, being someone with bipolar disorder, being someone who is a psychiatric survivor. I will continue to carry that with me, and it's never going to be overcome or disappear. But I can kind of build strategies for myself that allow that load to be a little bit lighter and to be shared with other people. And I think that writing, like doing mental health workshops, allows people to write together against a load that they're all kind of carrying in different ways, and acknowledging that we're kind of starting from unwellness, and unwellness isn't necessarily like a thing we have to banish, but a thing we can acknowledge and learn to be kind of work with. That's more my understanding. And so sometimes working with hospitals is interesting because that's not like hospitals, they would like they would like everyone to be like healthy. Like when you think about the definition of mental health from the World Health Organization, like it positions it, you're able to contribute to society, you're able to be productive. And for me, I think that sometimes we shouldn't have to be productive to be valued. And so I like Mimi's idea of teaching from that idea of unwellness as opposed to wellness as something that might be actually unattainable in many ways for people.
And as you're saying also, how do we make space for narratives, for stories that don't fit a certain expectation? You mentioned some of the mental health memoirs that have influenced you. And I think, we've had some discussions in narrative-based medicine circles and in writing circles that there's also a certain expectation, like people do like recovery stories.
Yeah.
And they like stories that follow a certain trajectory, whether it's mental health or other forms of illness or health struggles. And stories that fall outside that sometimes can be really hard for people to write, and they can be really hard for people to understand and accept, like as readers. And just wondered, your thoughts on that, because it sounds like part of your work is creating space for those stories.
Yeah, one of the first kind of like narrative medicine books I read was The Wounded Storyteller by Arthur Frank. And I remember reading about the Quest narrative and thinking about mental health rom-coms, like it's kind of a funny story or Silver Linings Playbook, in which that happily ever after is also paired with recovery. Like love and recovery are so intertwined in a really interesting way. And so I was interested in how like the stories where the trajectory is not simply up or down. Like a lot of mental health stories, like they end in tragedy. It's like this is a lesson to be learned, or it's a story that they did everything right and then they were happily ever after. When in reality, like people have relapses. I have relapses. Like it's not so linear. And so I was interested in stories that kind of navigated that gray area a little bit more, like the chaos narrative, perhaps, and had a less definitive ending. And so I wrote something like that. Like I think it is a happily ever after in my opinion, but sometimes people are like, well, this isn't it's not a Hallmark happily ever after. I think it's a very real happily working towards an ever after that we can see and be present for, because sometimes that's the hardest part about mental illness is like imagining past tomorrow or imagining past today. And so what does it mean to try and imagine a happily ever after when you don't see time in that way? So I teach disability studies, so I'm always talking about crip time. And my book does move through crip time in a way because it resists that linearity. And I think time passes differently when you're manic or depressed, or if you're having delusions, or if you are...
Or if you're in the hospital.
Or if you're in the hospital. Time is just different. Yeah. And so I like the idea of a happily ever after becomes more complex when you think about how crip time alters the way that we narrate illness a lot of the time.
Bearing in mind everything you've just said about linearity and time and happily ever after and expectations, you're writing, you're teaching, you're studying, you're working. Can you give us a sense of what you have planned next, what we can read or hope to expect, or what we'll see you doing?
Yeah, I'm continuing to teach. I love teaching disability arts and BIPOC literature classes. They are really, really special, like super small, creative academic classes. I think that I got through school by mostly doing creative work in kind of a weird scholarly way, and I hope that there's room for more weird scholarship going forward. So I'm always telling my students,
I like
write
the
really
idea of
weird
weird
stuff.
scholarship.
Yeah, I've always been like, I'm a weird academic, and that's the only way that I will ever be. So I'm working towards that. I'm in the supposed to be final year of my doctoral. I'm on mat leave right now, but I go back in September. And I've been working with Japanese Canadian communities and running writing circles around the impacts of incarceration, uprooting, and dispossession. And so in my community, it's very hard to talk about mental health, as in many other Asian Canadian communities. And so creative writing has been a really special way in for a lot of people, given that there's a lot of Japanese Canadian writers in particular. I feel like a lot of us are called to document injustice because of the history that we share. And so that's been a really interesting way of talking about well-being and community well-being in particular. And so I run writing circles. We talk about mental health in kind of a roundabout way. We use landmark pieces of Japanese Canadian literature to embark on those discussions, so everyone kind of gets a starting point that they feel a little bit more comfortable with. So I've been doing that for about 4 years. And I'm really interested to put down my own pedagogy, because people are always like, how do you come up with the workshops? And like, there are rules in my brain. There is like such a background to it, but I've never taken the time to write it down. I just host like all of these workshops. So I'm hoping that by making a teaching guide, other groups, because I think like even I went to a Japanese Canadian book launch last night, and they were talking about a lot of the solidarities between Indigenous communities and Japanese Canadian communities, because of course, dispossession of Japanese Canadians was mapped on the dispossession of Indigenous communities, and Japanese Canadian redress has been used as a precedent for other communities seeking justice from the Canadian government. And so I think that it could be the way that I run my writing workshops, whether or not we have the exact same history, I think could be used by other communities in a really generative way. So I'm hoping to create that. And then also on the flip side, that's kind of like the academic side of the project. On the flip side, Carrie Sakamoto, Michael Pryor, and I are putting together an anthology of Japanese Canadian writing about memory and place.
Wow.
And so that will kind of be the translation of it in creative land, I think, and I think my brain often works like that, where I work in both spheres, but they kind of end up coming together at the end anyway.
Wow, sounds fantastic. Thank you so much, Leanne. This was just an incredible conversation, and it just leads me to think about lots more questions, and look forward to hearing more about your work in these communities and how the writing intersects with all of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is really, I have to go home and finish the hermit crab essay now, because I feel like I said so much of it. Got to write it down now.
Thank you so much.